Less than one full day after India and Pakistan publicly declared a landmark ceasefire in the troubled Kashmir region, alarming news broke worldwide that fighting had already resumed, shattering any immediate hopes for peace. This unexpected turn of events swiftly transformed a cautiously optimistic international outlook into grave concern. Early in the morning following the ceasefire announcement, reports began to surface from the border regions indicating intense clashes had erupted again. India's military command promptly announced that one of their sophisticated Su-30 MKI fighter jets had been downed in the vicinity of the volatile Panch sector, a notoriously sensitive location that has frequently witnessed violent skirmishes between the two rival nations. Adding further complexity and urgency to the situation, Pakistan's military issued its own detailed statement, claiming that their forces had intercepted two Indian Rafale fighter jets after they allegedly breached approximately 7 kilometers into Pakistani territory. This alleged intrusion was described by Pakistan as a provocative act, triggering immediate defensive responses from their air force. Islamabad further emphasized its narrative by declaring that it had also successfully targeted and destroyed an Indian reconnaissance drone, which they said had entered their airspace illegally and was armed with weapons, a claim firmly rejected by Indian authorities. Indian defense officials quickly countered the Pakistani statements, categorically denying any offensive operations after the declaration of the ceasefire. India affirmed that its last known military aerial operation had occurred prior to the agreement, explicitly stating no such violations had been committed since peace terms were finalized. The rapid unraveling of the ceasefire has pushed both India and Pakistan back to a highly tense and volatile state reminiscent of previous severe confrontations, notably the Balakot strikes in 2019 and the Kargil conflict in 1999. The international community had enthusiastically welcomed the May 10, 2025 ceasefire agreement as a major diplomatic breakthrough, promising a period of calm and a hopeful reduction in violence along the contentious line of control, LOC. However, optimism proved tragically premature. Within mere hours of the announced ceasefire, alarming reports emerged from Indian-administered Kashmir about heavy artillery and mortar exchanges near Uri and Kupwara sectors. Indian military sources accused Pakistan of initiating this hostility, alleging the Pakistani army deliberately fired mortars and machine gun rounds at Indian military outposts without provocation. Almost immediately, Pakistan presented its version of events, asserting that Indian military aircraft, specifically Rafale fighter jets, had carried out unauthorized incursions into Pakistani airspace, launching limited airstrikes targeting locations suspected of harboring militant groups. Islamabad described these airstrikes as aggressive acts that directly violated the newly established peace terms. Indian authorities strongly disputed this claim, reiterating their commitment to the ceasefire agreement and denying any involvement in offensive military actions after the agreement had officially begun. The tense situation rapidly escalated during the early morning hours of May 11th, developing into the most intense aerial confrontation between the two nuclear-armed neighbors since the Kargil War. Pakistani military officials made a shocking announcement, asserting that their air force had shot down a total of 3 Indian Rafale jets, one Su-30 MKI and a MiG-29 during a significant aerial engagement. This dramatic claim immediately captured international headlines and intensified fears of a full-scale conflict. In response, Indian defense spokespersons categorically refuted Pakistan's account, offering an alternative narrative that detailed how their own defensive measures had successfully neutralized 2 Pakistani F-16 fighter jets and an armed combat drone near Muzaffarabad, a strategic city in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. To substantiate their claims, India released video footage from one of its reconnaissance drones, clearly showing explosions at a location identified by India as a militant training facility operated within Pakistani territory. Central to India's allegations is the charge that Pakistan has deliberately exploited the ceasefire agreement as a deceptive tool, providing cover to infiltrate militants into the contested Jammu and Kashmir region. Indian officials have consistently accused Pakistan of engaging in strategic violations to undermine regional stability deliberately. They further suggested that Pakistan intentionally created turmoil to maintain leverage over Kashmir, destabilize Indian governance, and exacerbate tensions along the disputed border. Conversely, Pakistan forcefully rejected India's accusations, presenting itself instead as the victim of calculated Indian military provocations. According to Islamabad, India's alleged aggressive actions were part of a broader strategy aimed at applying intense regional pressure on Pakistan, negatively influencing global opinion and ultimately sabotaging the newly established ceasefire. International media sources have shed light on potential third-party influences contributing to the instability, suggesting local extremist groups and radical factions might deliberately exploit the precarious situation. These groups reportedly seek to capitalize on uncertainties surrounding peace initiatives, intentionally provoking hostilities and sabotaging diplomatic progress to advance their own violent agendas. This possibility introduces a complex layer of ambiguity, further complicating an already fraught situation. The sudden escalation and breakdown in the peace process have deeply alarmed the international community, prompting urgent diplomatic efforts to prevent further deterioration. The United States responded immediately by issuing a strong statement calling upon both India and Pakistan to exercise maximum restraint, emphasizing the urgent need to halt hostilities and urging both sides to swiftly return to peaceful diplomatic dialogue. Additionally, China and Russia collectively issued a rare joint statement strongly advocating for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Both nations urged adherence to the principles outlined in the 2003 bilateral ceasefire agreement, emphasizing that dialogue remains the most viable path toward lasting peace in the region. The joint appeal underscored the critical importance of regional stability, given the global implications associated with potential military escalation between two nuclear-armed states. Recognizing the gravity of the escalating situation, the United Nations rapidly intervened by deploying an official monitoring team to the conflict zone to independently verify claims of ceasefire violations. Despite their prompt efforts, objective and unbiased evidence conclusively identifying the initial aggressor remains elusive. Both India and Pakistan steadfastly uphold their innocence, each side vigorously claiming victimization and squarely blaming the opposing party for triggering renewed hostilities. The resurgence of violence has understandably reignited intense global fears over the possibility of broader conflict escalation. Observers worldwide remain deeply unsettled, openly questioning whether the recent incidents represent isolated clashes or signify the troubling prelude to an intensified conflict between two nuclear-capable adversaries. With diplomatic channels still open, global stakeholders remain actively engaged in efforts to mediate between India and Pakistan. Urgent appeals for peace and stability continue to resonate internationally, highlighting the vital need to prevent the situation from further escalating. The immediate priority for all involved is de-escalation, stabilization, and the restoration of trust to pave the way toward meaningful and enduring peace negotiations. Despite widespread international calls for restraint and the fervent hopes initially generated by the ceasefire announcement, significant uncertainty persists. Both India and Pakistan remain on high alert, locked in a complex and fragile situation fraught with suspicion, accusation, and geopolitical tension. The immediate future of the region remains precarious, dependent on diplomatic wisdom, international mediation, and a steadfast commitment by both sides to prevent further escalation and ultimately achieve a stable and peaceful resolution. As the global community continues monitoring developments anxiously, the imperative for rapid diplomatic intervention and careful negotiation becomes ever more evident. The stakes remain exceptionally high, with the consequences of failure potentially catastrophic. The recent developments starkly underscore the fragility of peace in Kashmir, emphasizing the critical necessity for sustained diplomatic engagement, international mediation, and mutual trust between these historically contentious nations. Conversely, Pakistan has forcefully and unequivocally rejected India's accusations, presenting itself instead as the victim of calculated and unprovoked Indian military provocations. According to Islamabad's official statements, India's alleged aggressive actions, including the purported airspace violations and airstrikes, were part of a broader and more insidious strategy aimed at applying intense regional pressure on Pakistan, negatively influencing global public opinion against Islamabad and ultimately sabotaging the newly established ceasefire agreement before it could even take root. This counter-narrative positioned Pakistan as a nation defending its sovereignty against Indian aggression. Adding another layer of complexity and uncertainty to the already convoluted situation, various international media sources have begun to shed light on the potential influence of third-party actors in contributing to the renewed instability. These reports suggest that local extremist groups and radical factions operating within the region might be deliberately exploiting the precarious situation created by the ceasefire and its subsequent collapse. These groups reportedly seek to capitalize on the inherent uncertainties surrounding any peace initiatives, intentionally provoking hostilities and actively sabotaging any diplomatic progress in order to advance their own violent and destabilizing agendas. This possibility introduces a complex layer of ambiguity, making it even more challenging to ascertain the precise sequence of events and assign definitive responsibility for the renewed outbreak of violence. The sudden and dramatic escalation of violence, coupled with the swift and disheartening breakdown of the painstakingly negotiated peace process, has deeply alarmed the international community, prompting a flurry of urgent diplomatic efforts aimed at preventing further deterioration of the already perilous situation. The United States responded almost immediately by issuing a strong and unequivocal statement calling upon both India and Pakistan to exercise maximum restraint in their actions and rhetoric. Washington emphasized the urgent and critical need to halt all ongoing hostilities and strongly urged both sides to swiftly return to peaceful diplomatic dialogue as the only viable path forward. Furthermore, in a rare display of unified concern, both China and Russia collectively issued a joint statement strongly advocating for an immediate cessation of all hostilities. Both influential nations urged India and Pakistan to adhere strictly to the principles outlined in the 2003 bilateral ceasefire agreement, which, despite its intermittent violations over the years, had provided a framework for managing tensions. The joint appeal underscored the critical importance of maintaining regional stability, particularly given the potentially devastating global implications associated with any military escalation between two nuclear-armed states. This unified stance from two major global powers highlighted the international community's deep anxiety over the unfolding events. Recognizing the profound gravity of the rapidly escalating situation, the United Nations swiftly intervened by deploying an official monitoring team to the volatile conflict zone. The mandate of this team was to independently verify the conflicting claims of ceasefire violations made by both India and Pakistan and to provide an objective assessment of the situation on the ground. Despite their prompt and commendable efforts, obtaining objective and unbiased evidence that conclusively identifies the initial aggressor in this renewed cycle of violence has proven to be remarkably elusive. Both India and Pakistan have steadfastly and vehemently maintained their innocence, with each side vigorously claiming the mantle of victimhood and squarely blaming the opposing party for triggering the renewed hostilities. This lack of clear and independent verification further complicates the already murky waters of the conflict. The resurgence of intense violence has understandably reignited intense global fears over the terrifying possibility of a broader and more devastating conflict erupting between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. Observers worldwide remain deeply unsettled and increasingly concerned, openly questioning whether the recent alarming incidents represent isolated and containable clashes or, more worryingly, signify the troubling prelude to a significantly intensified and potentially uncontrollable conflict between two nations possessing the ultimate destructive power. The stakes involved could not be higher, with the potential for regional instability to spiral into a global crisis. Despite the deeply concerning developments on the ground, diplomatic channels between the involved parties, albeit strained, remain open. Global stakeholders continue to be actively engaged in frantic efforts to mediate between India and Pakistan, desperately seeking a pathway to de-escalation. Urgent appeals for peace, stability, and restraint continue to resonate across the international community, underscoring the vital and immediate need to prevent the situation from further spiraling out of control. The immediate and paramount priority for all involved international actors is to achieve a swift de-escalation of tensions, establish a degree of stability in the region, and, most importantly, foster the restoration of trust between the two nations to pave the way for meaningful and enduring peace negotiations. Despite the widespread and impassioned international calls for restraint and the fervent hopes that were initially generated by the now-shattered ceasefire announcement, a significant degree of uncertainty and apprehension continues to permeate the global outlook. Both India and Pakistan remain on high alert, their military forces mobilized and poised, locked in a complex and dangerously fragile situation fraught with deep-seated suspicion, mutual accusations, and enduring geopolitical tension. The immediate future of the already volatile region remains precariously balanced, heavily dependent on diplomatic wisdom, sustained international mediation efforts, and, most crucially, a steadfast and genuine commitment by both sides to prevent any further escalation of violence and ultimately achieve a stable and lasting peaceful resolution to the long-standing Kashmir dispute. as the global community continues to monitor these deeply concerning developments with bated breath and profound anxiety. The imperative for rapid and effective diplomatic intervention and careful, nuanced negotiation becomes ever more evident and urgent. The stakes in this high-stakes geopolitical drama remain exceptionally high, with the potential consequences of failure being nothing short of catastrophic for the region and potentially the wider world. The recent and deeply unsettling developments serve as a stark and sobering reminder of the enduring fragility of peace in the Kashmir region, unequivocally emphasizing the critical necessity for sustained and sincere diplomatic engagement, impartial international mediation, and the cultivation of mutual trust between these two historically contentious and heavily armed nations. The path to lasting peace remains fraught with peril, but it is the only path that offers a future free from the devastating consequences of renewed and potentially nuclear conflict. Less than one full day after India and Pakistan publicly declared a landmark ceasefire in the troubled Kashmir region, alarming news broke worldwide that fighting had already resumed, shattering any immediate hopes for peace. This unexpected turn of events swiftly transformed a cautiously optimistic international outlook into grave concern. Early in the morning following the ceasefire announcement, reports began to surface from the border regions indicating intense clashes had erupted again. India's military command promptly announced that one of their sophisticated Su-30 Mki fighter jets had been downed in the vicinity of the volatile Panch sector, a notoriously sensitive location that has frequently witnessed violent skirmishes between the two rival nations. Adding further complexity and urgency to the situation, Pakistan's military issued its own detailed statement, claiming that their forces had intercepted two Indian Rafale fighter jets after they allegedly breached approximately 7 kilometers into Pakistani territory. This alleged intrusion was described by Pakistan as a provocative act, triggering immediate defensive responses from their air force. Islamabad further emphasized its narrative by declaring that it had also successfully targeted and destroyed an Indian reconnaissance drone, which they said had entered their airspace illegally and was armed with weapons, a claim firmly rejected by Indian authorities. Indian defense officials quickly countered the Pakistani statements, categorically denying any offensive operations after the declaration of the ceasefire. India affirmed that its last known military aerial operation had occurred prior to the agreement, explicitly stating no such violations had been committed since peace terms were finalized. The rapid unraveling of the ceasefire has pushed both India and Pakistan back to a highly tense and volatile state reminiscent of previous severe confrontations, notably the Balakot strikes in 2019 and the Kargil conflict in 1999. The international community enthusiastically welcomed the May 10, 2025 ceasefire agreement as a major diplomatic breakthrough, promising a period of calm and a hopeful reduction in violence along the contentious line of control, LOC.